already mentioned, and some of the slides may be already have been explained, so I will take, maybe I won't stop in some of them. So if it's a little messy and it's different from the slides, it's because of this reason. So, okay. I'm going to provide a very quick overview from chapter 2, taking into account that we already had the author's overview, and then I will introduce a couple of critical comments. The most important one will be the difference in the context that we are dealing with when it comes to chapter 2, the moderation. And I will just raise the question about algorithms and see how could we have some more insight on that for this project. And after this, Abe will present his comments. I think not drawing on some of the overview I will provide. So here I have included the index that appeared in the book, just to give you a quick glance of the topics that are being discussed here. First, what is online content moderation, varieties of moderation and censorship debates, which will be very relevant to the point that Abe will make. The epistemic challenges of moderation, virtues of moderators, constraints of moderators, commercial content moderation and epistemic exploitation and epistemic dumping, and last, the algorithms. So I will, for my critical comments, I will talk more about the aspect of constraints of moderators and the commercial content moderation. And here we've heard already the most important points about online moderation. In Karen's talk, we have the problem. In her overview, she has centered herself on the problem of disturbing content, and we have discussed that to some extent. But some of the second problem we will face, and I'll try to underscore here, is that we also deal with the problems of hate speech and how are they moderated and what kind of biases we find when it comes to moderating them. So, and just to to mention some of the main points made in this chapter is that the commercial content moderation, the CCM, how it will appear, it's first of all, it doesn't drive the moderators to cultivate the proper epistemic virtues to do justice to some marginalized communities. So since they don't have the virtues because they are constantly fed up, as we said, 25,000 decisions each day, they don't have the time to really understand what's the context of these communications and that leads to some biases. But on the other hand, the commercial content moderation also leads to exploitation against these same moderators. And as she explains, content moderation is a ghost work. We already have mentioned that. It doesn't allow for moderators to cultivate epistemic virtues, and it makes it more exploitative. But now this is the point that I wanted to arrive to. When we deal with these two different kind of problems brought up by commercial content moderation, it seems like we have these biases, especially when it's about hate speech against marginalized communities, and we have the exploitation issues against the moderators themselves. And these two problems are exemplified through very different cases of contents, and that's what I wanted to underscore here. So we have the cases that open the chapter, problems like censoring tweets coming from black activists in the US saying, I think it was in the US, saying, white folks, when racism happens in public, your silence is violence. So this tweet was censored. And these other posts, like coming from a comedian mentioning men are scum, this was also censored and the author was banned for 30 days. And as Professor Arnold explains, this seems to be biased because some other reactions to these manifestations were not treated in the same vein. But on the other hand, when well, I want to mention also that when it comes to disturbing content, obviously some of the examples can be quite disturbing as well. So I try not to get into graphics description, but sometimes the book itself includes them. So I apologize in advance for that. And this is a fragment that also Karen used in her introduction when it's about the exploitative dimension against moderators. And we have examples of people being confronted with images of killings, like it's depicted here, a girl being sexually abused and then murdered. And it's yeah, it seems like this, like in fact, this case, like these different cases are used for these different problems, and I thought that this may raise different questions for that. First of all, what is the difference precisely between those kind of contents? Is it that some of them are verbal and some of them are non-verbal, like images or videos? Is it that they are graphic or non-graphic? Some other questions that we may raise is that is truth somehow implied here, playing some role here, because both of them are labeled under the category of epistemic trash, and this is one of the problems I had with the very distinct account. And we have some others that Glenn raised during our conversation, and he will explain in the fake news chapter. But here it also seems like if we take truth to be the fundamental epistemic value, then why would be this kind of disturbing contents something like epistemic trash? Like, it seems like the problem there is not that we have truth in this disturbing content, but all the way around, it's too true. And the more true it is, the more disturbing it is. So another question, apart from the difference between these two kind of contents that we may difference at first sight, would be to put under question how the epistemic virtues, specifically the epistemic justice framework, would work in this content for moderators. The examples we find for epistemic justice would be, for example, a willingness to change one's view and general ways of thinking, habits of virtuous listening, like knowing when to shut up, knowing when to suspend one's own judgment, go into all the account, and some other examples like concentrating on the sense of the speaker's words as he means them and actively blocking out the predominant epistemic practice of the white audience. But if we think about this graphic and disturbing content, how would these virtues help in dealing with this problem? So is there any way in which it can be virtuous to concentrate on the sense of the speaker's words? And here we have again the difference, assuming that we are dealing with words as he means them. So when we have these violent examples of people suffering abuses and some extreme tortures, is there any way which makes sense to concentrate on the sense of how they have been uploaded? And I think that a case can be made, given those cases, to blur the distinctions from these two contents that we have differentiated at first sight, holding what Karen points out in page 51, that context in like speech is ambiguous, and it also applies for cases in which we are just presented with images of violence. Say someone can have uploaded that for denouncing the acts that are taking place. Also, it can be uploaded for threatening other people without saying anything, and maybe we can be in position sometimes to take that intentions in mind. But even in those cases, cultivating these epistemic virtues of hearing, trying to understand why this has been uploaded or not, it seems that protects some part of a community that is denouncing something, but the harm's performance against the moderator will still take place. And this drove me to think that we may be working under the assumption throughout the chapter that working against one injustice means working against the other, and all the way around, but it may not always be the case. They can be independent. So I try to start to finish my point. I think this distinction of taking into account different contents that have to be moderated and being clear on them would help us to drive to some more epistemic specialization of labor, like we were mentioning some minutes ago. For some kind of contents, the epistemic virtues and epistemic justice can be something that we can renounce to, but in some others, it may be just off the table. If we just are being shown some videos of violence and we don't have any context of that whatsoever, it seems like it's not epistemic virtue what is at stake here. So that could lead to maybe some moderators being training in more epistemic justice and virtues, and some others more training into resilience or maybe psychological training. And I had some minor comments to go further on that, but I just want to make the last point. So this could lead us to believe that if in some cases epistemic virtue can be off the table, maybe we could make a stronger case for algorithms. And I just wanted to mention that we could, like, there is a whole, like, one of the main problems that was underlined by Karen in the proposal for algorithm moderation would be that it would help companies to avoid responsibility, saying it was the algorithm that says or this or that, so we have no, we play no role in this. And then maybe we can elaborate further on some debates that are already taking place on the epistemology of algorithm or the agency of algorithms, and try to develop more robust theories, trying to explain at the one hand that algorithms do have some kind of agency or some kind of autonomy to perform the task at stake without the knowledge of the precise knowledge of what is going on in them, coming from the company. But on the other hand, saying that the company can still be held responsible for the consequences that this algorithm have. For example, explaining that they are delegating on them, just as they could have been delegating in any other agent without knowing the details of how are they performing the job. And these were my two main points: making a distinction on the contents. Some other contents that didn't appear here would be also fake news that didn't appear in moderation. Would be something interesting to say how are they moderated or not. But I just want to leave this here and give the word to Abe.
Okay, and our next speaker is Abe Tobi from the University of Johannesburg, and he's going to add some thoughts on chapter 2, Moderators.
Thanks very much, Veli, and thanks Karen for the book, and thanks Daniel for starting off for this chapter. Like Veli said, I'm Abraham Tobi from the University of Johannesburg. I'll just jump right into it. Now, the cases I start with are cases that Daniel has already highlighted. All white people are racist. Start from this reference point or you've already failed. This was Didi Delgado, and like Daniel said, she was banned for 7 days for having that post. Leslie Mark, white folks, when racism happens in public, your silence is violence. She was banned for 24 hours after appeals were made for her case. And these other posts, Men Has Come, by Mercia Belsi, she was banned for 30 days for having that post on. And in this her situation specifically, she tried to get her female friends, other comedians, to post Women Has Come and get those posts reported. Nothing was done in those situations. It was totally ignored. But Men Has Come, get reported, you get banned. So just an overview of the kind of landscape. Now, when things like this happen, it takes away the general belief or thought that we have that the internet is this unregulated space where, in a sense, we get the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression that traditionally most people wouldn't have had available, right? And this job is done by moderator, like I'm guessing we've all come to find out so far. Now, the crucial question that this chapter looks at is what's the epistemic label that these moderators have to take on to do this job of moderating for us. Just the definition of moderation that's used throughout, so we have just this general idea from Sarah Roberts, is as the organized practice of screening user-generated content online in order to determine the appropriateness of the content for a given site, locality, or jurisdiction. Now, for the rest of the talk, building on some of the points that Daniel has made and some of the initial discussions we had earlier, I'll focus on two aspects of the chapter, and those would be the aspect of the nature of content moderation and the epistemic challenges of content moderation. Now, from these two things, I come up with, well, I didn't come up with them. I highlight three effects that Karen talks about in the chapter that might arise from these two aspects of how content moderation happens. And then I just hone down on what I think is a central feature of these three effects. And then I give my thoughts and I consider an objection to my thoughts and kind of respond to the objection. Now, the nature of content moderation, something Daniel has mentioned already. The world of content moderation is heavily commercialized, right? For most of the content moderation for most big tech companies, they're outsourced or subcontracted to other companies, usually located in third world countries like the Philippines, for example. And in these places, these workers are made to work in low wage situations. They get paid really low wages, and they're expected to produce at an astonishing, unrealistic rate. So some people get up to 25,000 photos a day of gory images to say, okay, this should go up, this shouldn't go up, and you're supposed to make decisions on that. Think of YouTube also, for example, the amount of videos that gets uploaded in a day on YouTube, and there are people who are supposed to sift through these videos to ensure that they are all appropriate to be online there. So the nature of this job is routine, fast-paced, solitary, and a point that has already been highlighted, it's global. So this group of people in this warehouse or wherever they are housed are supposed to moderate content for the entire world, regardless of the context of those information. Now, with this sort of situation that moderators are having to work under, there are certain epistemic challenges, right? The first highlighted in the chapter is the initial identification of potential problematic speech. In most cases, the way these moderators get to encounter this problematic speech is when it's flagged by users as either hateful or whatever flag the user decides to go with. Now, the problem with flagging, right, is that it's a thin form of communication. In most cases, you don't get the opportunity to say why you are flagging a particular post. You get a list of reasons, and you're supposed to pick whatever is closest to what you think the issue is with that post. and it's also vulnerable to manipulation and systemic bias. Again, think of the case of the case I mentioned of Marcia Belsky, right? Posts that were flagged by men got taken down. Posts that were flagged by women stayed there, even though the only difference from both posts is men as scum versus women as scum. So it's subject to this. And for instance, if I post something that's, I don't know, is against a famous person, and they have lots of fans that think I shouldn't say things like that, they could all decide to flag my post, and yeah, my post gets taken down or my account gets blocked. So that's the first epistemic challenge. The second epistemic challenge is the ambiguity of online content and the paucity of the contextual information that is available to moderators. So when these informations are posted online, again, the global nature of moderation means someone is supposed to make a decision on this post without properly understanding the context of this post, or understanding in some cases, for instance, is this an actual instance of hate speech or is it a parody of hate speech? These contexts are not available to the moderators. What they see is a post flagged for hate speech, and if you have to go through 25,000 posts a day or photos a day, I doubt you would want to do some digging around to properly understand the context of most of this information. And even in some cases, I think one of the cases that was considered in the chapter, these moderators say they are encouraged by their supervisors to not think, don't think, just get it done. You don't need to think too much. You don't need to ask experts in that area to know whether that's appropriate or not. Just get the job done. Now, from these epistemic challenges of moderation and the nature of moderation itself, right, there are three effects that I have highlighted that this would lead to. The first is that, again, think of the case of the first three cases I considered, the silencing of epistemic agents. These are people that, based on their social reality and condition, are trying to express things about their reality. They get silenced as a result of moderation. The second effect is that this moderation is exploitative, something Daniel talked about in details. People working in conditions getting paid $300 a month for going through these sorts of content daily. And there is also, again, an overload for these moderators that they have to go through. We can think of the psychological trauma that they have to go through, for instance, watching videos of beheadings every day since you work as a moderator who's supposed to sift through content from terrorist organizations or potential terrorist organizations. Now, a third effect, again, Daniel mentioned this and Karen talked about it earlier on, is epistemic dumping that these moderators have to go through. So this form of epistemic injustice is one in which the labor of sorting, handling, and disposing of the toxic trash of an epistemic community is disproportionately performed by some groups within that community. And the entire community benefits from this. In most cases, most members of this community are not even aware of these behind the scene jobs that goes into them getting these meat contents, in a sense, that they get exposed to. Certain members of the community have to take care of their epistemic trash. Now, from these three harms or effects of the nature and the harms of content moderation, I think a central feature is that the epistemic agency is being impeded to varying degrees. Think of the case of silencing as an epistemic agent trying to get your word out there, trying to get your message out there about your social reality. There is a harm on your agency when you get silenced in this way as a result of moderation. Think of the exploitation that happens with moderation. Again, we can see how that's a direct harm to the epistemic agency of these moderators that perform the moderation. Same story with the epistemic dumping. We can see this epistemic injustice as a direct harm to the epistemic agency of these moderators that have to sift through these harmful contents. Now, if we see most of these effects of moderation, the way it's carried out, and the harms it leads to as harms on the epistemic agency of the moderators and also the general public. I know in the chapter, Karen says she's not going to get into the debate on whether we should have moderators or not, specifically because they exist. So how should we go about living with these people that exist in our society? But I kind of think that these arguments on the harms that moderation and moderators face is kind of good enough argument for us to say we probably shouldn't have moderators in these online platforms, right? And my two central reason is the commercial model of moderation. It's not something that I see as having any potential for disappearing, especially because these social media outlets are built for commercial purposes. And the second is the epistemic dumping, something Daniel highlighted. If we are to look at case of social justices and see them separately, when you think of the violent images online, that epistemic dumping still happens. So as long as we have moderators, even if you pay them way more money, they are still exposed to this sort of epistemic dumping of cleaning the trash for the general epistemic community. So I think these are sufficient reasons for us to do away with moderation. But even if we think these reasons are not good enough, I also think what I had identified as a central feature, this harms our agency. What this does to our epistemic agency should, again, be another reason why maybe we should consider doing away with moderation. So how do I understand epistemic agency to, in a sense, back up this argument or claim that I'm making? On Catherine Elgin's account, epistemic agents should think of themselves and act as legislating members of a realm of ends. They make the rules, devise the method, and set the standards that bind them. And for this account of epistemic agency that Catherine Elgins argues for, it's from Kant's idea of a moral agent. But again, I think it's properly applicable to us as epistemic agent and how we should understand ourselves as epistemic agents. So now, based on this account of epistemic agency, now an autonomous agent, right, is supposed to make the law that bind them, rather than having corporations with very obscure laws on what should be moderated or not moderated, make this decision and have people just accept it. Epistemic agents should be able to make this decision, and I think the agency of users of social media platforms should be taken quite seriously, because with how it is currently, there is a sense in which we are heteronomous agents. We just stay, we are bound by whatever constraints, right, these social media companies make. And if we are to take our agencies seriously, I do think to some extent, it's important that we focus on autonomy when we think of moderation more generally. And this doesn't mean if you're an autonomous agent, then there is no room for you, for example, to be an heteronomous agent. That's exactly where responsibility comes in. That's why you could be held responsible for, say, the views you hold as an epistemic agent, precisely because there's something that goes into you holding that view. And this thing on what goes into you holding that view is almost like a story on endorsement, right? So this sort of agency provides reason for the beliefs that you hold. So I can't say, yeah, I was fed this information by my Facebook feed, so hey, I'm not responsible for it. This is what the people in charge think is appropriate, and so I should just gullibly believe any information I get online. Because this is also another dimension of some of the issues concerning consuming information online and how our agency comes into play. With moderation, we take away this possibility of fully exercising our agency, especially in certain aspects, right? And that's where the distinction that Daniel makes comes into the picture when we think of instances of hate speech or silencing that happens online versus instances where gory images are posted online. In the one instance, we think of so think of the instance of hate speech, for example. If I post something online and I get silenced because the moderators think it's inappropriate for me to have posted that information, that's a different story versus when the moderators think the images of beheading, for instance, should be taken off of the internet. These are two different things. In one instance, I don't see how taking off images of beheading affects my epistemic agency, but when I try to share things about my social situation and this gets cut out, there is a sense in which this affects my epistemic agency. And that's why I think the distinction that Daniel makes is very important when we think of the sort of information that we are moderating online. Now, exercising this epistemic agency means I'm responsible then for what I choose to believe. So is there fake news? Are there false information? If I have carried out my due diligence, then I know I am reasonably or justifiably accepting whatever I choose to defend as my view or what I take to be the case. Now, if we take this to be an adequate account of epistemic agency, right, like I've mentioned, relying on moderators would prevent us from being proper epistemic agents because we don't do the job of coming to knowledge by ourselves, but we stay passively and just let any information that is deemed to be right appear on our feeds, and this is what we go by. Now, beyond the general benefits of not having moderators, think of the epistemic dumping that we might take out of the picture, think of the risk of silencing that we might take out of the picture. It also makes the process of making decision, not making decision, the process of embracing the information online a bit more democratic, in the sense that every member of the community has a say as to what they think should be online and should remain online. I'll try to clarify this point shortly when I respond to an objection to this general proposal that I'm making. Now, with a new understanding of flagging, participation in the epistemic community can be bolstered. I'll explain this sort of new understanding of flagging that I'm referring to, but more generally, agents now have a direct access to their epistemic communities. Now, this new understanding of flagging that I'm talking about, generally the way flagging works, a content gets flagged and the moderators decide on whether it stays or goes. Why don't we understand flagging in such a way that members of an epistemic community who interact with a post online decides whether they think that post is appropriate or not. And then me as a user, if I go on that platform and I see that post, I would have almost like a note or a warning that certain members of this epistemic community thinks this about such and such post. Now, with just that awareness, I'm able to say, okay, so I want to engage with it in the first instance. And in the second instance, I'm also able to make the decision for myself, well, by doing my due diligence now as an epistemic agent as to whether I accept this post or not. In this way, we participate in the general decision making, and it also makes the process of moderation less opaque. We know we are the ones doing it as members of the epistemic community, rather than these vague behind the veil policies that these social media companies have that we are not aware of. It also takes away epistemic dumping because we don't have a group of people constantly having to deal with our trash as an epistemic community. Now, the very clear objection to what I am saying, doing away with moderators, is that what about exposure to hate speech or other violent content online? Is it a proposal that says, yeah, it's free for all, go there, you might encounter harmful things online. How do we make this space cleaner? My response to it is maybe we should change the role of flagging, and that's what I was mentioning. So if members of the epistemic community thinks this information shouldn't be there, then there should be in a sense, and I think Facebook does it to a certain degree, where they blow out the image and say it's violent content. You choose whether to engage with that content or not. Maybe that sort of understanding of flagging might be helpful. I think we should have a limited form of moderation. I know my basic story is that we shouldn't have moderation at all. But yeah, maybe a limited form of moderation. And this limited form of moderation, again, builds on some of the points that Daniel has made. But this form of moderation now, I think it could be based on a rights framework. So if we say content is being taken out, why are we taking it out? Is it because it directly violates certain human rights? For instance, beheading, for instance, child pornography. Those are, in a sense, clear-cut cases. When it comes to cases that requires knowledge of the social situation, those sorts of cases, like the 3 initial cases we considered, right? Those sorts of cases, I think, should be left to the epistemic community that have the context to understand those kind of posts, to adjudicate whether those posts are appropriate for their engagement or not. This will be very important, again, with categorizing content, a point Daniel has mentioned. If we categorize contents in this way, then yeah, we might be able to differentiate between what we think should be moderated and what shouldn't be. Now, there is also the risk of epistemic dumping, right? Okay, in a sense, we all as a community, we take care of our epistemic trash in this sense. But with some other things, and the things that I think should face this mild or limited form of moderation, like say beheading videos or videos of child pornography or things like that, maybe we can have a role for algorithms. Now, one of the central issues that Karen noted with algorithms is that it doesn't have that social context, that human touch to be able to understand things in their social context. I don't think there is any social context for child pornography where it would be like, oh yeah, maybe it depends, right? So I think in certain clear-cut cases like that, there is an argument that could be made for how algorithms can effectively deal with those sorts of situations. I know I've made this argument, but still, how does it adequately solve the issue? I guess it's something we can talk about in the discussion session, but yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Abe, and thank you for the moderate claim at the end, because I thought I was out of a job, you know, like altogether. Great, so Karen, did you want to say a couple of words, or how do you want to play it? Do you want
I can go quickly, so plenty more other people. I have a tendency to talk fast anyway. Yeah, Dan, I really liked your criticism that there are 2 different types of things going on here. And I'll be honest, part of the reason why I used the more graphic image stuff in the second section was actually totally for political goal. I really wanted to use the most vivid examples to get people concerned about moderators. And I think you really highlighted how there's kind of a philosophical problem with just switching from hate speech to graphic content. I hadn't really thought that people would imagine, oh, I'm saying that the virtues in the first section were necessary for this section. I was sort of just like thinking of that as a cut. And so I think that's really helpful and makes you just think, gosh, there's so much more work to do, right? Because what would be, right, unless we take Abe's proposal and algorithms are dealing with some of the most graphic content, what would be the virtues that would be necessary for moderating graphic content? So I just think you're completely right about that. And was there anything else? Let me move on to Abe for a second. Abe, I really liked your proposal. There's a lot of interesting work on community moderation that folks are working on that might be really useful for fleshing out this proposal. And I know that there's another great book, Speech Police by David Kay, who was the UN rapporteur for freedom of expression, who talks about using human rights as a standard for content moderation. So there's a lot of really cool proposals there. I guess I just want to maybe put on the table another form of epistemic agency, which is not just the ability to read something and reflect on it, but also to be an epistemic agent. I need to be able to contribute to my community. And I'm worried maybe under your proposal, if we were just getting rid of beheadings and pornography and stuff, and not this other stuff, I really don't see how, for example, women are going to participate online. So the amount of vitriolic attacks that women politicians, women journalists experience on Twitter that actually has moderation to some degree already, like the amount of testimonial smothering that would happen with very minimal moderation, unless we are a really vigorous community, but also we're a patriarchal, sexist community, right? So I can completely imagine that the epistemic agency of women, people of color, queer folks online would be thwarted in their ability to fully participate in communities with very thin levels of moderation. And to be honest, that's why like you took on the question that I was like, this is so hard, I'm not going to talk about it in the chapter. And you're like, okay, I'm going to talk about it. I don't really know what to do with this question because on the one hand, I think we need some moderation, otherwise it's just going to become privileged people who can speak online. But on the other hand, why would we trust a community or Facebook to moderate in the interests of marginalized people? So that's just a form of agency that I might throw out there as also working. But yeah, I think both of you are so right about.
Sorry, I'm not stalking people, but there was an audience request from online for the faces of people on the comments. Do you want to just switch to your camera if you want to?
Switch.
So do we have other? Glenn.
Oh, wait, no, I have to get
No, okay.
All right. Yeah, so yeah, thanks to all of you. I have a question for Karen, and unfortunately, it will be again about the the veritistic approach and framework. Because I think Daniel also brought this up, but I'm really wondering if here the veritistic framework is not like an active problem for you, right? Because when it comes to this epistemic trash, then it does seem like, at least from a veritism point of view, these are true beliefs that are to a certain extent valuable, right? They're not completely useless in an epistemic sense. If we value truth as kind of the highest good, and yet there seems to be something like a burden of knowing, and then knowing in this weak sense that veritism just calls having a true belief. So I do wonder in what sense you can like reconcile that, because it seems fine with all the other frameworks used, but when it just comes to truth as the highest good, it doesn't seem like someone is harmed in an epistemic sense by doing this content moderation. In fact, actually, they're given a lot of true beliefs, which I think are not completely without value, right? They're not useless information like how many pebbles are there on a beach or something like that. So yes, I was wondering like how you were thinking about this framework in this chapter particularly.
Can I just clarify, are you talking about the moderator themselves is not harmed by seeing all of this stuff, or the user who's prevented from seeing?
Well, I mean the moderator is the moderator is harmed. Is not harmed, right?
Yes, psychologically harmed, but epistemically.
Right, but they're not really harmed epistemically. And you could argue the people who are being protected from this, right, from the burden of knowing this, are being harmed in the sense that they're not getting this information.
Yeah. I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I think one thing to think about is that veritism, like a Goldman's version, doesn't, like it says that we want to know important, relevant truths. So one question you might ask is, am I being prevented from having relevant truths be vivid to me, like that human beings are not all monsters who are beheading. Like if you see, that's all you see, right? So the examples of the moderators who like won't shake people's hands or are afraid to leave people alone with their children because they're seeing all of these truths. You might say, but that's maybe not veritistically helpful because it's sort of swamping out other truths that you might have access to, that not every person on the internet is a complete monster. So maybe there's some way to handle it there and thinking about quantity of truths that you're exposed to, and there might be some kind of veritistic harm for being exposed to somewhat, for your life, irrelevant truths and not being able to gain access to relevant truths, which is that not everybody you're going to encounter as a monster. Right, I just completely agree. I think it's a good word to have, but I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, thanks,
I think I have nothing to add already.
Do you want to just switch
So I'm thinking of I don't know how this would help in terms of the violent contents I'm thinking of, say, the other aspect of it, so the epistemic injustice stuff. I do think there is a sense in which there is a distinctly epistemic harm at the base of this, right? That we can strip out the social harms and social wrongs from these situations, and maybe the considerations would not primarily be considerations of justice. We could have primarily epistemic harms. Because if you think of cases of epistemic injustice, for instance, the basic story is that certain people's truths, very loosely, is being marginalized, right? So to what extent is the available truth the full picture of what's available? So I think there's a sense in which there's a very basic epistemic harm. In these instances, before we even talk of the issue of social justice and those other considerations, I think those considerations make it obvious that there's something wrong going on, but take it out of the picture. I think anyway, there is a purely epistemic harm. I'm not sure to what extent now it helps in this instance of violent images online, right? I'm not sure to what extent, because with most of those other things, they are purely social ills that we are trying to curb, I would think.
We have a question from Clarice. Sorry, that is.
No.
Okay. We have a question from Clarice online.
Hi. So I wanted to ask, with the talk there, with moderation, I mean, sometimes the content can be completely removed, but sometimes it's just demonetized. So in the presentation that you gave, it seemed like the main point of moderation was taken to be kind of to make the platform habitable. But I mean, when it comes to demonetizing content and not just removing it, the point there is mainly to keep a good relationship with advertisers. So I wanted to ask if you think that your argument against moderation also applies for demonetization, where they want advertisers to still use the platform. Yeah.
I think that's a question for you.
That was a question for Abe, right, Clarice?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Clarice. So the stuff on demonetization, I'm not sure to what extent that would really count as moderation, because the whole idea of moderation is we are trying to keep the space. Well, it's moderation in a sense, right? If you think of the norms of, say, YouTube, for instance, the sorts of things they want to have there. But if you still have the content there and it's only the person that posted it that suffers from not making money, again, that now would point to some of the problems with the commercialized approach to, say, moderation and most of these platforms in the first instance, because if advertiser relation is more important than, say, some epistemic virtues that your site probably should have, then yeah, there is a fundamental problem. Not sure if, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question, another question online. Do we have questions here? Jason, remember you've already abused your birthday privilege once.
Right, then I'll give you a 2-for-1, because I've got a comment for both of our comments, our commenters. So here's the quick thing. I'm interested in the idea that it's not just, truth value doesn't capture all of what we care about the difference between these two types of content we could imagine. So the thought that came to mind was the difference between being informed of the salient details of something horrific happening as opposed to seeing it. But the question of what moderation can be understood as doing there is focusing. it pulls focus depending on the purpose of having that information. So I don't need to know. I don't need to see someone being beheaded to understand the horror of someone being beheaded. But it may be that there's very valuable content that the look in George Floyd's face or the sound of his voice carries, which is relevant to the project of making his condition and the condition of others like him apparent to me. But the question of which of those is the appropriate focus is the job of moderation. And in journalistic contexts, that's where trained editors evaluate these things with filters, but with communally generated, with user-generated content, the standard isn't there. So I want to note that question doesn't turn simply on what degree of truth is coming out of it, and that's brought up sharply there. And then I'll close off with how this relates to Abe's point about, I was interested that he said, you know, it's hard to imagine anyone disputing child pornography. And it's easy to imagine certain epistemic bubbles arguing that a picture of a drag queen reading a book to a child constitutes child pornography, and thus we move the goalposts and it all gets ugly. And I'm interested in the fact that this decision about who needs to be exposed to what discomforting claims being in the hands of the moderators, Michael Sandel said that we need to settle matters of disputed public policy to whatever degree we can, because they shape policy, but that might be impossible on issues like this. I'll shut up now. Thanks.
Do you want to go first?
Okay, so just to be clear on what is the point I would have to answer to, just.
I suppose I'm mostly saying that the distinction you've raised between these two positions is valuable, but it pushes further against the idea that we can draw the distinction simply in terms of verity. It's the degree of granularity of information we get there. The value, if we're going to interpret the value, it's going to have to be explicitly in terms of projects. What is the point of making this at this degree of focus apparent? So I don't know if it's a criticism. I think I'm agreeing with you and trying to frame that in those terms. How much focus is necessary on the particular details is going to make a difference between whether we need to see or hear this or simply have it described. I don't want any further documentation of a horrific crime that happens somewhere sometimes. But then again, neither do white voters in Florida want to be told the detail of things that they probably should be exposed to, but they can now claim that they want to be protected from.
Okay, so I mean, if I got that right, the problem would be, first of all, again, what is the veritistic approach? What is the role that it's playing here, and how truth again is what justifies some things being allowed or not. And as I understood that, also it would be important to take into account how not only whether truth is the main relevant good here, but also how truth is presented, right? Like you can present the same like information or knowledge or in very different ways without having to disturb someone. Yeah, and that makes me think that I was wondering how would we draw a line between these two kind of contents that were presented in the book. We could have, as I mentioned, some other contents in need of moderation, like for example, fake news. If we have in mind that truth is such a important value to preserve, maybe apart from these two concepts, we also have to take into account fake news as a different problem and what is moderation trying to achieve. So what I wanted to say in particular is that when thinking of the particular distinction between these two cases, is that maybe it's more about even some psychological reactions to what you are being shown. So it's not that they are truth or not, they are true or not, not that whether they are promoting hate speech or not, but maybe the problem is how it is presented to provoke a reaction. I don't know if that clarifies anything of what you are trying to get to.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I agree with you, right? I mean that's part of the reason why towards the end I was like, I'm not sure to what extent what I'm proposing answers the question, because we'll just keep moving the goalposts, so to speak, right? Different people and their different in a sense moral or social outlook would mean that what maybe I would think is obvious and we should leave to the algorithms to just decide. I'm like, wait a minute, no, there is still more debates to be had here. And I mean, that's part of the reason why I think more generally it's difficult to even have this moderation stuff. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent that answers that kind of worry to setting what counts as very obvious cases of things to be moderated.
Cool, thanks. We've got 2 minutes. Do we have a quick question or any final comments? Dimple.
Mine is just like a little comment, right? And I'm just talking about moderation and stuff. I'm just thinking, if I understand the focus of moderation just being like a negative, you know, kind of like a negative aspect of moderation. But I think more broadly, there's also like a positive thing, you know, that comes with the moderation. And you know, thinking of it also from like a positive perspective makes me really worry about Abe's suggestion of having the community as moderators, you know, given we live in a very, you know, like a very vicious society, so to speak. So it becomes very difficult to see how we navigate, you know, those kinds of social ills that exist in society, and to what extent I understand the conversation needs to happen between both sides, but to what extent do we have a moderator, you know, kind of mediating that conversation seems to be something that's significant to a certain extent. So yeah, I do see I appreciate the positives of moderation, but just, you know, to contribute to the conversation, although there are these negatives, and I'm really struggling in my head to find a way in which we could have both minimal moderation or just the positive aspect of moderation, whilst at the same time minimizing the negatives that come with moderation. And with algorithms, we know, I think Kanimo will know best, algorithms have their own, you know, embedded ills, and yeah, it's really, it's a struggle. And I've tried throughout this conversation to try and find a way to balance the two, and I'm really just struggling. Yeah, but you do a good job to just, you know, share or just give us an overview picture of how moderation happens and what comes with, you know, all of this moderation. So yeah, it's just.
So Karen, do you want to solve this problem quickly?
No, I mean, I completely agree. That's exactly where I am, and I just I don't really know where to go with that. I mean, my dream is, right, get a bunch of intersectional feminists, right, like people who really understand social justice, who have a good account of what oppression is, who have a good account of what exploitation and harm is, and then make decisions from that, right? So that clearly drag queens reading story time to children is not pornography, right? With any understanding of what harm is, right? And understanding of homophobia. And so I think the problem is exactly as you said, that's not the world we live in, right? So on the one hand, and say, do I want profit-making companies to make that? Well, why would I think that they would have those kinds of principles? But do I believe that a community would have that? Is exactly as you said. No, I don't either. So maybe it's how can we wrest control of the of the reins of the community as people who care about justice, right? Like how could we convince people that I mean, this is just like, people should just be standpoint theorists, right? And recognize that the marginalized people should be in control of these decisions. But I don't know how to convince everybody to be standpoint. I'm just completely with you. I don't know how to say.
Thank you so much, and thank you, gentlemen, for a great presentation from two very important points
Thank
here.
you.
We're now going to have lunch, which was supposed to have been already served over here, but presumably they'll bring it in, and then we can maybe go for a little walk around the campus, and we reconvene at 2 p.m. South African time. So thank you to the online audience as well for hanging in. And sorry we can't feed you lunch. See you in an hour and a bit.